it's getting to be very broadly acknowledged that the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers that was the instigating event of this latest cycle, which, at this point is really, this is an operation obviously on the order of cast lead. It's very significant. It's very large, and the death toll is obviously very, very.
Netanyahu just said that Israelis must be ready for a prolonged military campaign against Hamas in Gaza.
Right. So that's what's happening. So since the beginning of these kidnappings, there has never been not only not any definitive evidence that Hamas was involved in these kidnappings, all evidence pointed to quite the opposite. There were a couple of theories that seemed viable. One theory was that, this may have even been just more of like an act of gangsterism, as an example, that these kids were kidnapped by some more like mafia type people looking to maybe get a ransom, get some money. Then when things kind of spun out of control, they decided to just kill them and kind of wash their hands of it. And then the other scenario, which seems to me to be the most persuasive and a lot of people have gone with, was that this was either a rogue Hamas cell or some type of cell which maybe had some type of affiliation with Hamas, but was clearly not operating on any type of orders, and probably in contrast to orders, that went and took it upon themselves to carry out this operation. Now, as we always say, this is a mere several weeks after Hamas and Fatah struck an agreement to govern in coalition. Now, has Hamas continued in these tunnel buildings, which incidentally has been a failure of Israeli intelligence to not see them? Does their charter still call for death to Israelis and the end to the Israeli state? It certainly does. But we also know that it wasn't just this agreement between Fatah and Hamas. We know that, yes, there's Iron Dome, but also over the last several years, Hamas has actually been a force of restraint within Gaza, within the context of governing Gaza, within, I would say, the 2000, after in the post-cast-led environment. So that has been the reality. They have not been shooting rocket fire into Israel. And even when the conversation about this has been fascinating to watch over the last 2 weeks, because they resumed rocket fire after military operations began. And now the conversation has shifted to rocket fire because the notion that the 3 teens were murdered on the orders of Hamas leadership have really been thoroughly debunked, to the point where even Israel is not presenting it in the same way. But at the beginning, Netanyahu said Hamas is responsible and Hamas will pay, as an example.
Can I ask you a question,
but
Michael?
now, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Let me just finish
finish
this.
that.
But now Israeli officials admit that the kidnappings were not Hamas's handiwork at all. This is from a piece in New York Magazine. They thought, comments from Israeli spokespeople now indicate that they recognize that it was a lone cell operating and not under the orders of Hamas leadership, which is, of course, entirely in contradiction to what Netanyahu said at the outset of these operations. I mean, certainly if senior Hamas leadership ordered this, that would be absolutely legitimate grounds, not for these operations, but actually to boycott talks with a coalition government for a little while between Fatah and Hamas. That's not what happened. So the point is that even as Israel now has backed off of this claim, and we also have to look at it in a domestic Israeli context, it seems clear as well that the Israeli intelligence services, the Israeli government, knew that these kids were murdered. They were gone. And they put a gag order on press in Israel and used this campaign to whip up a frenzy, which makes absolute sense. Missing teenagers, anybody's going to be worried and concerned about that, as a means and a mechanism through which to pursue this military action. And some people are comparing this in some ways to the Israeli WMD. In the same way, if we hyped intelligence on Iraq, they hyped intelligence about these murders. So, I think as that gets clearer and clearer, and it's always been clear to people who followed this and have some knowledge of this, that this was not a Hamas operation. It was not ordered by Hamas. It was completely illogical. There's no reason Hamas would do it. There's no reason they would do it after an agreement like that with Fatah. It made no sense whatsoever. And this, incidentally, is a really important, and I see this in the conversation about Hamas that we have that gets generated around us. I see some people, like the guy who complained the other day that I condemn Hamas, and they wanted just Hamas as simply a freedom organization of oppressed people. That's a ridiculous way of looking at Hamas. If you cannot, you need to be able to look at and clinically assess every tactic and tool that groups use, period. And Hamas has used many tools and killed many innocent people, and does call for a very right-wing, very fanatical politics, and does, in fact, violate people's human rights in Gaza. Again, this is not the core story, but that's a reality. On the other hand, there's other people who are so defined, like the word Hamas stops thought process. And I'm telling you that just as the British people needed to deal with Sinn Féin and the IRA, despite whatever operations they may have engaged in, and just frankly as supporters of and Sinn Féin and the IRA needed to deal with the British, Hamas is going to need to deal with every single faction in this conflict, if it's ever going to actually get solved, is going to deal with people that have blood on their hands, period. That's reality. That you talk about having an adult perspective. Sitting in a room with Bibi Netanyahu and all ministers that have been involved with these operations, you know how much death is on their hands? And they're going to have to do it. And you're going to have to talk to Hamas. You're going to also have to need to hear a story about Hamas without immediately just, oh, Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Hamas is a complicated guerrilla organization, governing organization, and yes, at times a terrorist organization. They do have engaged in those tactics, absolutely. But you need to deal with them maturely and not believe every single thing that's just thrown out about them just because they're Hamas. Who is the leader of Hamas? Read their charter, understand their politics, not to justify, explain, or be a fan of them, but to be a cold, clinical analyst and realistic viewer of real situations. That's important. Now, I think that the impetus behind this was, I think Netanyahu has really been adrift because his particular brand of right-wing intransigence is increasingly transparent to the world. The fact that he governs in coalition with a couple of ineffective centrists, but people to the far, far right who are calling, like as we said last week, that other important Likud member, not in government but in Likud, calling for ethnic cleansing. We have the rise of settler parties formally calling just to annex West Bank and Gaza. He boycotted talks with Fatah and Hamas, and the United States was frustrated with him for doing this. What he needed to do? He needed to get Hamas back in this central role, in this pariah role, which, again, have your own conversation about Hamas and have many, 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 many criticisms of them, but that simply does not explain the situation. He wanted to use them there and get them as a distraction, and that's what this operation's about. It's recalibrating Israeli politics. His popularity is improving, and it provides some, and also but in the end, who is the real target? The real target is not Hamas. The real target is Fatah. Because Mahmoud Abbas, who has followed a diplomatic path with Israel, who has worked very hard to maintain Israeli security in the West Bank, as many people have pointed out, he's done. The West Bank is starting to rise up as well in solidarity with what's happening in Gaza. And Netanyahu and the right in Israel does not want a moderate Palestinian opposition. They don't want partners for a two-state settlement because they don't believe in it. And you need to face them as they are. This has nothing to do with not being concerned about Israeli civilians and Israeli people, but this government does not want peace, does not want two states, and they will do anything to maintain what the status quo is. And what is the status quo? It's endless blockade, occupation, systemic violation of human rights. That's the reality. That's it.
So
Yeah.
So my question was,
Yes.
these 3 Israeli teens,
Yes.
they were kidnapped in the West Bank.
Yes.
They were found dead in the West Bank.
I believe so, yes.
And so
So
Israel
this is
goes ahead and attacks Gaza.
Well, because that's where Hamas is headquartered, and they claimed that this was a Hamas operation. I mean, that's what I mean about having this thought process with Hamas is very problematic, because it's like and I feel like, I mean, it's what's amazing to me is I know that even as I say this, I know people write and say, oh, he's defending Hamas or justifying Hamas. I'm doing nothing of the kind, but I'm saying some people listen as soon as they hear the words Hamas, even if it defies geography, even if it defies rationality, even if it defies basic evidence. They just did it, and that's it, and that's period. And that's the role that, Hamas has played. So, yes, that's exactly what happened, and it makes absolutely no sense.